Imagine you find yourself in the central square of a small village in a foreign country. Tied up against the wall are 20 villagers, and in front of them several armed soldiers in uniform. One of the soldiers turns out to be the captain, and explains that the villagers are a random group of inhabitants who, after recent protests against the government, are just about to be killed to deter future protesters. However, since you're an honored visitor from another land, the captain is happy to offer you a privilege of killing just one of the villagers yourself. If you accept, then as a special mark of the occasion, the other villagers will be let off. It is clear to you that any attempt to overpower the soldiers will mean that you and all of the villagers will be killed. The men against the wall and the other villagers understand the situation and are begging you to accept. What should you do?
Hey everyone, welcome to You've Got It All Wrong, a philosophy podcast for handsome people like you. I'm Paco Allen.
I'm Mark Sanders.
And I'm Chad Allen. So what do you guys think? Kill one of the villagers?
It seems that's going to be the best outcome for everyone involved. Everyone seems to be on the same page, right?
I guess.
How big's the village?
You mean like in total?
Yeah.
And what is their main export?
25 people.
Yeah, and what is their main export?
Coffee.
Delicious coffee.
Delicious.
Are these villagers happy or are they like working under extremely poor conditions to produce coffee for the industrialized world? Would they be happier dead than working than slaving away in the coffee fields
No.
in the coffee mines?
They would rather be alive than dead.
But you have actually just saved 19 people's lives, right?
By killing this one person, for sure.
You've saved you're a goddamn hero.
So Mark, you've just shot someone.
I'm wearing the medal to show how much all the other people love me for it. All the wives, the mothers, and the children.
Right now, at gunpoint, the surviving villagers are erecting a statue in Mark's memorial.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't think this is the first time this has happened. They seem to be all very calm about it.
Right. Okay. Yeah. The last time this happened, somebody made the wrong choice.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
They lost
20
a
people
There's only
died.
25
their
people left.
Yeah. Man,
Paco, would you like to kill a villager?
that seems like a different question than what you proposed to Mark. No, I wouldn't like to kill a villager. The question is, am I going to? I mean, in the safety, in the safe confines of this podcast room, then the answer is yes.
Yeah.
I think that's the tricky thing about this is the theoretical and hypothetical conversation versus what are you doing when
Right.
you're standing there having to pull the actual trigger.
Well, and that's why this thought experiment was written in the first place. So,
What do you do? You're not off the hook.
Oh, no, I was just going to
Okay.
talk about philosophy and then not
Yeah.
answer the question.
Did you murder?
No, I don't
one of
think
these villagers?
I would not kill one of the villagers.
Interesting. God damn it! You did more research than we did. Didn't you?
Man, what's the catch?
So this thought experiment was actually written by Bernard Williams, who was a critic of a moral theory generally known as utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. So consequentialist moral theories focus on the outcomes of our actions and attempting to maximize the goodness of the outcomes of those actions. And in the case of utilitarianism specifically, we focus on maximizing utility, where utility is generally defined as happiness or pleasure,
or the lack of
or the
pain,
absence of pain
the
and
absence of pain.
displeasure. Right. So you're trying to maximize happiness, minimize pain, and a utilitarian is looking at the maximization of utility across the entire universe of sentient beings.
Like what's if you were to combine the total positive versus the smallest negative, like
Right.
the overall net
Yeah,
positive.
exactly. So that's what you're trying to maximize. And so if you're a utilitarian, then it seems like the thing that you should do in this scenario is kill one of those villagers, because the net pleasure or net happiness or net utility is, kind of like 19-1, basically.
So just going back to your answer, so is there a take where if you don't do anything, it's as if you weren't there, and if you weren't there, those people would have been killed without your intervention or responsibility at all anyway?
Sure, and that's kind of one of the things that Bernard Williams says, is that, there's a difference between you acting to kill someone, which is what you would have to do in this scenario, versus you're not being there at all, right? Like the fact that you have to make this decision to kill someone, and that you have to kill someone, is important, because you then become the agent of not only the positive outcome, but the negative outcome, which is the death of this one person. So he says, I'll just read you a quote, which maybe will say it better than what I said. So that he says that there's a crucial moral distinction between a person being killed by me and being killed by someone else because of an act or omission of mine. The utilitarian loses that distinction, turning us into empty vessels by means of which consequences occur, rather than preserving our status as moral actors. So, this is one of the critiques of utilitarianism in general, is that it just kind of turns us into, sort of like utility calculating algorithmic robots who have to be constantly doing the math on whether our actions are producing net positive utility. And it sort of strips us of our status as actual like moral agents, and we're just kind of like utility calculators.
It sounds like a plot device for a sci-fi short story, where all of those calculations happen on our behalf, so we're never responsible for the bad decisions we have to make.
Yeah. So I'm sure there's a thought experiment in there, right? Where like every choice I make, like I just like run that through an algorithm, and it tells me which choice is going to create the greatest utility, and then I just do that.
And it could be something you like to do, but it would be slightly worse for someone else, but that's okay, because hey, the machine told me to. Like,
right.
Overall, it's positive.
Or it might be something terrible, like you have to torture this small child in order to like prevent an entire village from being blown up or something, right? And so like that like strips you of like any sort of ability to make moral choices like relative to your own character. You just become sort of like a conduit of utility.
Sounds like communism.
So does Bernard Williams have a ethical moral framework that he proposes as the better solution? Is because to some degree I feel like we're not getting out a spreadsheet and making a list of pros and cons of every action that we take, but I think like on a practical level we are kind of going through our lives and evaluating every decision we make based on a balance sheet of the overall good and negative effects that those decisions are going to have, whether it's fairly isolated to ourselves, like am I going to eat this burrito that's super delicious but
so delicious,
it's kind of bad for me.
I just did that, by the way.
Listeners at home. It's probably why I was top of mind, or some other decision that is going to increase my personal pleasure and maybe the personal pleasure of other people, but it's got some drawbacks. Like I feel like we're kind of constantly making those balancing decisions in our head, from a moral standpoint.
Well, let me answer the question about Bernard Williams first. And I don't want to like make this a podcast about Bernard Williams, because it's like, this is he's a complicated figure, and he did a lot more than just
no one understands him but his woman.
Right. Did you get that from the Wikipedia article?
Huh? What you talking about?
What you talking about, Williams?
So the answer to your question is no. He actually did not propose
for
like
everyone
an alternate.
That was a Shaft reference.
He did. Actually, that was a different Strokes reference.
Yeah.
What
you talking about, Williams?
What are you talking about, Willis? What you talking about, Williams?
Oh, so you parlayed my Shaft sing-along reference into a different strokes. Same thing applies. Okay, so for everybody under 30, that was a Shaft reference followed by a different strokes reference.
So I mean, sidebar. Williams actually did not believe that you could create a structured, coherent, universal, complete moral theory. And so he was a critique of a wide range of moral theories and of the philosophy of ethics in general. But leaving that aside, to your point about aren't we always just sort of like trying to do the back of the envelope math on like which decisions are going to maximize utility? There's a that makes me think of a couple things. One, there's a critique of utilitarianism which says, well, nobody can actually do that math in their head. So it's like a bankrupt theory because it doesn't actually provide us a way, like it doesn't provide us any like actual guidance in the real world, because we would just spend all of our time trying to like predict the outcomes of our actions. And that would be a futile effort because there are so many variables. And so one of the responses from utilitarians to that point, and John Stuart Mills, who's kind of in some ways like one of our modern touch points for utilitarianism, if not the modern touch point, he starts to formulate, although he never calls it this, the notion of rule utilitarianism, which is that, yes, by and large, we are trying to maximize utility. And that is the goal that we have as moral agents. But because we can't do all these complicated calculations every time, we have a set of rules that we live by that purport to maximize utility.
Basically, over time, you look at the major actions that you can take in life and say, over time, it's kind of been proven out that killing somebody leads to bad results. So, as a rule, as a utilitarian rule, killing people is bad. So instead of trying to evaluate every single instance when I want to kill someone on a daily basis,
right?
No one's going to blink at that.
No, we know you.
Okay,
we know you.
Yeah. So instead of evaluating every single day, like whether or not killing somebody is good or bad at every single turn, we just apply that rule as a society because over time it's proven out that killing people leads to bad things.
Right. It's a heuristic. It's a rule of thumb. It's like you don't always have to know exactly the mechanics of how the black box of a rule of thumb works. You just know that it works for 80% of the situations.
Right. But so then the problem with that is the other 20% or whatever, right? So take a heuristic or a rule of thumb like don't tell lies. Right. I mean, we can sit here and dream up all kinds of scenarios all day long in which we would all agree that the ethical thing to do is to tell a lie. Right.
I just listened to an episode of 99% Invisible, and part of that story was about these two kids who were raised by psychologists or psychiatrists. I can't remember, like both their parents, and they were raised in this environment where everyone basically told the truth all the time, and the parents got divorced and brought the kids to all of their therapy sessions.
Oh my God.
And so these two kids like grew up, they interviewed them as adults, and they were basically like, didn't know how to function in the real world because they just told everyone they ran into exactly what they were thinking all the time.
Jesus.
And one of the brothers had basically decided that was still the way that you should live your life, being honest 100% of the time with everybody.
Right.
And the other kid was basically decided that is a bankrupt way of trying to live his life, and it destroys all of his relationships. He's never been able to have a girlfriend because they go out on a date. And as soon as she does something that annoys him, he tells her.
Right.
This is really weird.
I mean, he needs some basic rules of thumb of how to talk to a woman. I think that you can.
Mark's the man to provide them
in a handy laminated wallet card.
The SS comes to your door and says, "Are you hiding any Jews in your house?" Right. The right thing to do is to lie and say no. So this heuristic of like, don't tell lies, it breaks down really fast. And the way that you're going to try to save it as a utilitarian is to say, well, don't tell lies except in cases where telling the lie will maximize utility. Well, now you're right back into the business of trying to calculate the utility of any given lie you may or may not tell. And so that rule, you can start to chip away at rule utilitarianism by saying, well, look, if the whole fucking point is to maximize utility, then, you know, any rule you come up with, you're going to quickly come across exceptions to that, which very clearly lead to greater utility. And so you're just going to end up right back where you started.
Did Bernard Williams just in the end basically say, like, just go with your gut?
No.
How did he make any decisions if he couldn't find? This sounds like one of those classic dudes who comes to every meeting with a bunch of problems and no solutions.
Yeah, I think that we should definitely do an episode about Bernard Williams because he's super interesting. But I think we should stay on task here and talk about utilitarianism.
Okay,
Because that would be focus on the outcomes of what we want to achieve.
Right.
okay.
And maybe even the consequences.
Right.
So we just talked about rule utilitarianism.
Right.
Is there any other kind of utilitarianism?
Well, the two major branches are rule utilitarianism and act utilitarianism. And act utilitarianism is that we kind of also talked about already. That's kind of the classical formulation, which is that every decision you make should be an attempt to maximize utility. And rule utilitarianism was developed as a response to the critics of act utilitarianism who said things like, well, you're never going to be able to like calculate the utility of each decision. If you go down that path, then, you know, you're going to spend every last moment of time in your life and every last penny you have trying to maximize utility because, you know, every time you're faced with a decision about whether to buy a Starbucks coffee or, you know, donate to charity, you're going to have to donate to charity. Like, you know, every single small decision in your life will be governed by this like overwhelming set of rules that are, you know, forcing you to maximize utility at every turn.
Yeah, I read one. I'm not sure if there's a comment thread on a discussion, but one model was equivalent to planning out a cross-country road trip by traveling on side streets and street.
Right.
And, you know, you have to plan out the entire trip to get there, or you just, you know, look as far as your headlights can tell you how far you're going and make sure you always follow the rule of, like, go east if you're going, you know, from Los Angeles to New York. You just try to condense it down to an approachable set of rules.
Right. And now there's a whole other critique of utilitarianism in general. And I guess we didn't talk about this at the beginning, but the utilitarianism or consequentialism stands in contrast to another kind of moral theory, a set of moral theories called deontic moral theories that propose a set of rules that we should live by. And those rules often capture things that critics of utilitarianism claim that utilitarianism overlooks, concepts like justice and fairness, which are not really baked into utilitarianism. So I'll give you another thought experiment. I think in the villagers one, there's this pretty strong temptation to say, if I can sacrifice the life of one person to save 20, then that seems like a fair trade. As much as I, in the moment, don't want to pull the trigger, a lot of people will say yes, but if I step back and look at that scene, it might make sense to kill that one person.
Especially in that instance, because the one person you're being asked to kill is going to die anyways.
Yeah.
It's just by whose hand.
Right.
And they're all okay with it.
Okay, so let me give you a different one. Okay, so imagine that there are 6 patients in a hospital. 5 of them are going to die without an organ transplant. It just so happens that one of them needs a liver, one of them needs a heart, one of them needs kidneys, one of them needs lungs. There's a 6th person. So those people are patients 1 through 5 in rooms 1 through 5. There's a 6th patient who, if we kill him, will be able to harvest his organs and save all 5 of those other people. So now the question is, if you are a doctor at that hospital, why should you
not for long?
Well, it depends on, maybe it's the Hospital of Utilitarianism.
Oh, don't fucking check me into that place. You need to be really sick to get you to want to go there, because now you're on the other side of it.
Right.
Better chance that you're on the other side of the coin in terms of not being murdered to save somebody.
Okay, so now this is like a slightly different scenario, right? In which you are going to have to kill an innocent person who is not going to otherwise
It's not
die.
complicit with it.
Yeah, I mean, he came to the hospital for you to like fucking help him, right? But now you're going to kill him in order to save these other 5 people. And seems like a harder, from a utilitarian perspective, it still seems like, yeah, we should kill this guy and harvest his organs, because it's like, 1 person versus 5. If we're looking at sort of like the aggregate pleasure across these 6 people, then we'd rather have 5 persons worth of pleasure or happiness than 1 person's worth of pleasure or happiness. So we definitely need to kill this dude and harvest his organs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one potential argument against killing that person to harvest their organs, even from a utilitarian standpoint, and maybe this is just me looking for a loophole in this thought experiment, is that
that's what thought experiments are all about.
As soon as you start to make that decision, and then imagine those types of decisions being made broadly across society, pretty soon everybody finds themselves living in a world where it's really hard to be happy at all at any point in time, because at any point in time, your life could be snatched away or bad things can happen to you because it maximizes the utility of the greater group, and you just seem to be kind of living at the whim of the master computer, that is larger society making decisions about the overall benefit of the group. And it seems like a pretty horrible place to live. Like maximizing, if the goal is to maximize the happiness or the lack of pain, like imagine all the people that are terrified every time. Everybody who goes into the hospital is terrified that that's going to happen to them. Yeah. So it's like now you're causing pain, like mental pain, to every single person every time they enter a hospital, because God knows if, or doctor knows if, you're going to be harvested to save a bunch of other random people.
Yeah. Can I actually just bring up, and I know this is actually crossing over one of our internal rules or heuristics on the podcast.
Man. Are you going to bring it sci-fi?
You talk about the Matrix?
Are you talking about the Matrix?
No, I'm going to talk about a classic Trek episode where Captain James T. Kirk and his crew arrive at this planet that
that somebody else already wrote the book, The Philosophy of Star Trek.
And also, I passed up an opportunity to talk about a Voyager episode that I saw recently, like 5 minutes ago. So go for it.
All right, Mark, I've given you for those listeners at home who don't know, there is an explicit rule around the podcasting table here to not use science fiction movies or television shows as examples to illustrate philosophical points.
And primarily The Matrix and Star Trek. I mean, those are
because I feel like it's the easy way out. It's intellectually lazy. But Mark, proceed with your intellectual laziness.
The laziness yet delicious episode where these two warring factions on this planet have been engaged in a war for generations.
This is Star Trek Classic.
Yeah, classics is, and they've actually evolved to a utilitarian point of view that has avoided any issues where civilians are killed or any friendly fire, and they basically have one master computer, like so many of those classic episodes had this master computer running their society, and it would evaluate and model out what a battle would look like between those two factions, and then generate the most realistic outcome in terms of the number of casualties and dead on either side. Then that number would just be broadcast to both sides, and those number of individuals in the society will just go into a large chamber and just get incinerated. And it was a very clean way to have a war, no unintended casualties, and they just carried on. The next battle would simulate how many casualties on either side, and they just went along with it because that was the cleanest, most utilitarian way to do it.
If the same number of people die at the end of the simulated war without the fun of the war, or all the side benefits.
Well, it
of like,
costs less money.
yeah, I mean maybe, but like think about how much money we made through the military-industrial complex in World War II. Like you lose all the benefits of jobs and advancement of technology. We wouldn't have gotten to the moon.
They
man.
believe they'd escalated both sides so much they were so equally
They've maxed
stacked.
out.
They maxed out their technological
All right.
sophistication.
So like Civ 5 style, you've maxed out like your tech branch. Okay.
Okay, so
What did Kirk do?
he broke.
Who'd he make out with?
did he violate the Prime Directive?
Yes, and,
Yeah.
he basically his tactic was your society is stupid and broke their computer.
Yes.
The episode number will be in the show notes.
Yeah. It's like hard for me to even believe that the Prime Directive existed in classic Star Trek.
Yeah,
I mean, not that anybody pays attention to it in any of the other series, anyways. But
no, it's like a very common plot point,
Yeah.
right? Should we break the Prime Directive or not?
oops! Oh, oops! We already did.
Well, let's just roll with it. Where were we?
Yeah, Mark, you got to get back on track, Mark. You sidetracked. So
Yeah,
get us back.
you brought in Star Trek. You have to now do the hard work of bringing it back.
Rule versus act.
Okay, so we were talking about the people in the hospital.
Yes,
Yeah,
we're talking
yeah,
about
yeah.
the peaceful
So,
hospital.
do I have to make another horrible choice on air and like publicly admit
Yeah.
that I'm going to harvest organs?
Yes.
Have we gotten to the part where this person's a serial killer?
No.
Okay.
So potentially, if they're a serial killer, we're
No,
totally justified.
if 80s horror movies told me everything, if this guy's a serial killer, the right thing to do is not to harvest his organs and put them into anybody else, because now you got yourself five serial killers.
Man, I got a serial killer liver. I better drink this beer like a serial killer. Woo!
What was the one with the guy where he had an arm transplant from the serial killer? And
God.
like the arm was monkey shines, or I don't know.
See
It'll
show
be in
notes.
the show notes. Yeah. Okay. Well, fuck.
So you're just doing this because I'm the one that has to do the show
I
notes.
failed. I failed the first test, so don't kill that person. Yeah, they're innocent and they're not going to be killed anyways. So I don't sacrifice that person.
I think
Mark
right,
Sanders, MD.
I think there's a big criticism in a lot of countries around the world, particularly ones managed by very dictatorial governments, where this is a routine practice. The fact that dissidents in China are being harvested for the organs so they can be given to high-level party officials, and in that regard, a centralized organization which is guided by the utility of an entire country is making those decisions very clearly and plainly.
Right.
You just destroyed our Chinese iTunes ratings.
Yeah. Which are super high right now. So thanks a lot.
For the Chinese audience, please email back around.
Yeah.
So I mean, so wait. So you're killing the guy? or not?
No.
So why not?
Well, one, because I failed the first test.
Right.
So I got to make up for that. I mean, I think the big difference here is that person isn't going to die anyways.
Right. Okay, but let's now imagine that they are going to die. Like they've got one organ that's failing,
Okay.
and they're going to die.
Mm-hmm. This sounds like one of those things where there's a rabbit, a fox, and a bag of wheat and a boat, and you got to get them all across. Which organ of his is failing?
One that nobody wants?
Yeah, exactly.
One that nobody wants.
Well, if he opted into this in the same way that we opt into...
No, he's not. He doesn't want to go. You're going to have to literally kill him with your own two hands.
Is there a doctor who's just a couple of weeks
Doctor Who?
before retirement and therefore was no longer going to be covered by any kind of legal
Sure.
disclaimer?
Yes, I will give you that.
And maybe
doctor.
maybe that doctor only has a few weeks to live as well.
Well, yeah, okay, but the point is, there's some moral agent, some human who is going to have to walk into the room and, against this person's wishes, effectively murder them.
Right. Because we already have, in terms of the donation banks, we have rules, decision-making capabilities around utility, and the fact that if a liver or a heart was made available, it's going to be prioritized to someone who's young rather than someone who's old, who has a history of other deteriorating diseases.
Well, this is also like a huge political, ethical, moral debate in your home country when it comes to liver transplants in particular.
Australia?
Australia. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, viewers who assumed that I was from Australia.
Because of drinking, alcoholism, and cirrhosis of the liver, and the number of people who, I mean, it's crazy that there's that much hard drinking going on in the UK, but the number of liver transplants that are needed because of people who have liver disease and cirrhosis of the liver from like a lifetime of hard drinking.
Yeah.
Like there's debates about laws about whether or not people shouldn't be allowed to be put on the lists for liver transplants if it's basically like self-inflicted liver disease.
So Paco, you are going to murder
no,
the
I'm
patient.
not. I'm not going to. This is like the third time you've tried to get me to say that I'm going to murder the patient. I'm not.
No, what I want you to tell me is why you're not going to.
I don't know. It's really difficult to like specify why that feels differently than
The villagers.
So are we at the point now where this person is going to die anyways?
They're going to die like a year from now.
Okay.
You're going to have to end their life prematurely against their will.
No. Nope.
And if that person wasn't there, all of those 5 other people would have died anyway.
Yeah, they're going to die anyway. Yeah. Yep. So and I think the reason we resist the utilitarian impulse to sacrifice this one person is because we, again, there's this notion that we are not just conduits of the utilitarian algorithm, right? We are sentient, self-aware beings who need a reason to act. I said I wasn't going to go back to Bernard Williams, but he says that like any plausible moral theory needs to be one that is magnetic, that actually has like a pull for us. Like that actually utilitarianism just doesn't work as a moral theory because no one would ever like actually, like, it's just not how we view the world fundamentally. Like, we have some concepts such as fairness and justice that are kind of baked into the way that we view the world, and it's not possible to counteract those through the construction of some abstract moral theory. So there's like a fundamental like principle of justice and the importance of human life that's going to prevent you from killing this guy, despite the fact that there is some mildly attractive moral framework called utilitarianism that seems to work out in the right way in lots of other cases.
It's like an attribute of a functional utilitarian paradigm must be its own utility, which is where fairness and justice have a prevailing value because they're those magnetic systems that means we will actually use an approach, a theory, a way to manifest our expression of our lives and our culture in a way that makes sense to us.
But are frameworks like utilitarianism, I mean, do those exist to try to describe how we make moral and ethical decisions in our lives? Or is it an exercise in trying to develop a system that makes us behave better?
It's the latter. So it's definitely normative and not descriptive. It's prescriptive. It's saying we should behave this way, and the reason it exists is because, like, as critical thinkers, we want to have a consistency about the way that we interact with the world, right? We want to be able to say, I'm making this decision in this scenario for these reasons. Not I'm doing this because I feel like it.
And you want to be able to say, you've made the right decision or you've made the wrong decision. So, like, you deserve some kind of punishment or you deserve some kind of reward because you've made a decision. But I mean, so like, I kind of reject the idea then that it needs to be magnetic, that it needs to be the kind of thing, if I'm understanding the description of how he's using the word magnetic properly, there are a lot of things that are better for you to do that aren't magnetic.
Right.
And like a lot of times it's trying to overcome our, like biological programming.
Right.
Like we live in a world, in the Western world now, where our food is a completely different type of nutrients than what our body evolved to consume. And we still crave things that are sweet and sugary and still crave carbohydrate because there wasn't a huge availability of that stuff, before agriculture and manufacturing. So now we have to like overcome that built-in urge and desire and kind of go against what feels natural and feels magnetic or feels good to do the right thing.
Right.
I don't know why it would be.
And I guess the thing I keep coming back to Bernard Williams because I think he's like a really complex, interesting figure in 20th century philosophy. But the person that you would usually talk the most about in this discussion when trying to sort of distinguish other moral theories from utilitarianism is Immanuel Kant. And so he's kind of the classic deontological philosopher who believed that rules should be that moral frameworks should consist of rules, and so the Kant's categorical imperative is like that's the thing that he's most well known for in moral philosophy, and it basically says something along the lines of take any moral decision that you have to make. If that decision were to become a rule or sort of like a guideline for how everyone else should behave, then that is probably then that's a good rule, right? So he talks about this idea of like your decision becoming like, manifested in the world as a rule. And like and so that then becomes kind of the guidepost as opposed to does it maximize utility?
It's pretty golden rule-ish.
It is very golden rule-ish.
He was German, right? Phil's German. Sorry, Germans. Sorry, Chinese. Sorry, Germans. Sorry, South American village.
It wasn't placed in South America.
Well, Bernard Williams' original formulation of the villager thought experiment was placed in South America, but I stripped all of that out. But thanks, Mark.
Feel free to go read his extremely insensitive original thought experiment.
See show notes.
So anyway, yeah, I mean, I'm glad we brought Kant into the discussion at the very end, because I think we should kind of like wrap up and get to some of the history of ideas stuff that we wanted to talk about in the second half of the show. But we will come back to Bernard Williams at a later date because I'm a big fan. And I think that he helps us get out of this jam that we find ourselves in where we can only choose between utilitarianism on the one hand and rigid rule-based systems on the other hand. Because if we talk about Kant and we like go down the rabbit hole of the categorical imperative, you'll also find yourself in a situation where these hard and fast rules that you have to set for yourself start to break down.
Sweet.
All right.
Awesome.
To the mid-show break.
Hey everyone, it's Mark. We just wanted to take a few seconds and thank everyone for listening. And if you're enjoying the show so far, there's something we'd like to ask you to do to help us out. Head over to iTunes and give us a review. And while you're there, don't forget to subscribe to the show. Ratings, reviews, and subscriptions are the main factors that determine whether we get noticed and the podcast becomes a weekly fixture in your ears. We'd really appreciate the support. Now back to the show.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of contemporary utilitarianism. And so like if you take a introduction to ethics course, you're probably going to read a book by John Stuart Mill called Utilitarianism, which he wrote in 1861. And his story is kind of interesting. His father, James Mill, was a friend of Jeremy Bentham, who was a moral philosopher who was really kind of the first contemporary 19th century philosopher to frame utilitarianism in the way that we currently understand it. So one of the interesting things about the sort of history of utilitarianism in the 19th century is that, so James Mill was John Stuart Mill's father. He was friends with Bentham, who was really the first utilitarian scholar, and James Mill really felt that, and Bentham also felt that this philosophical framework was important because of its implications for politics and social justice, and social reform. And so James Mill, for example, was a political activist, and he was one of the driving forces behind the Reform Act in Britain in 1832, which kind of expanded voting rights to include more working class people in urban areas, and reduced the amount of power that was held by the moneyed classes who lived on their estates out in the country. And so he really felt that utilitarianism, this sort of max smoothing out of pleasure or utility across the greatest number of people, was not just a moral framework, but also a guideline for how to construct laws and kind of
Organized
guide
society.
politics and organize society. And so the story is a little creepy, though, because he basically decided that the pursuit and advancement of this philosophical framework was so important that when his son, John Stuart Mill, was born, he basically groomed him from day one to be a Jeremy Bentham acolyte, and basically decided that his son was going to sort of carry the flag forward for utilitarianism. And so John Stuart Mill, who wrote the textbook on utilitarianism, didn't just sort of accidentally come by that. He was raised from early childhood to be the 19th century kind of conduit of utilitarianism.
Do you think there's at all a reaction to to Darwin's theory of evolution that came up at roughly that same time, kind of mid 19th century, that really exposed the certain fundamentals of the fact that we are descended from animals that were red in tooth and claw, and the fact that there was a political and social aspiration for us as a species to be better than that, to have certain systems like this in place that we were aware of?
Potentially. I mean, I've never read anything that draws that link specifically, but you could certainly I think thread that needle. There's definitely, from Jeremy Bentham's perspective and from James Mill's perspective, there was a concrete political reason to espouse this utilitarian moral philosophy. And actually they sort of, in the kind of history of ideas surrounding utilitarianism, a lot of people contrast it to the ideals that came out of the French Revolution, which were very much about sort of personal liberty and freedom and justice.
I was just going to bring that up. Yeah.
And that didn't necessarily work all that well for a lot of people. And so the utilitarian point of view, in some ways, was a reaction to that.
Well, although I guess you could see a direct thread into the American Republic in terms of life, liberty, and the pursuit of freedom.
Yeah.
Happiness.
The maximization of happiness. Yeah. So anyway, I just thought it was really interesting that I never knew that about John Stuart Mill. He basically he didn't go to school. He didn't have friends when he was a kid. He was basically
he was just learning how to be John Stuart Mill.
He was and he had a nervous breakdown when he was 20, which he attributes to the fact that he had no friends and no life, and all he did all the time was study. So anyway, really interesting story of this kind of manufactured philosopher. And then one other interesting thing real quick about Jeremy Bentham. And actually, before I say that, all these guys, by the way, were, I think, what we would consider very progressive for their time. In the mid 1800s, they were pro women's suffrage. Jeremy Bentham actually spoke out against the mistreatment of homosexuals. They were anti-slavery. There were even hints of animal rights in their writings. So that's utilitarian sort of strain led them to a lot of thoughts about equality across a whole like range of issues. Jeremy Bentham, this is the last thing I'll say about him, was kind of a weird guy. And one of the things that he had in his will is that he wanted his body to be mummified. And
Fuck, that is awesome.
And kept
that is going into my will.
So he put in his will that he wanted his body to be mummified and to be placed on display. And this actually happened. And you can go see it today at the University College in London.
I would have to say his head, that's not the original head.
It's not the original head.
Because students used to like just pick it up and just
right.
mess around with it.
So the head used to be the subject of many campus pranks, and so now it's like it's a fake head.
Yeah.
But it's like his like original clothes.
And he used to be rolled out for meetings.
Yeah. Well, it still is. It's still rolled out for meetings of the college council. I think it still is. And Jeremy Bentham would be listed in the meeting as present but not voting.
So my one question I had for you about Jeremy Bentham.
They should let him vote with a Ouija board. If they're gonna do that kind of shit, just like roll out the body,
he's gonna vote, right?
bring out the Ouija board.
Oh, utilitarian votes.
He's always gonna vote to maximize utility.
Yeah,
like,
but then you got to do the math on like what is the actual maximum utility, and the only way to get that answer is from the afterlife through the Ouija board.
So talking of the afterlife. You watched Lost, listeners. I'm going to give you a Lost spoiler for the last season. Spoiler alert, Locke dies.
Yeah.
Locke, the character Locke, who's named after a moral philosopher, when he's
John
dead,
Locke,
uses another pseudonym in his obituary of Jeremy Bentham.
Oh, yeah.
What was there any significance with John Locke taking on board the identity of Jeremy Bentham when he's dead?
Hold on, let me call J.J. Abrams.
Yeah, I'm good fucking luck. I'm getting a straight answer about what the fuck that show is about out of that guy.
The only thing I thought was the fact that his dead body is like such a prop through most of that season. It's almost like he is being wheeled out like Jeremy Bentham. Like that's his note to everyone else. Hey, move me into the scenes whenever possible.
No, like after season 3, basically anybody new that they introduced on that show, they just gave them the name of a famous scientist or philosopher just so that you could go down the path of trying to figure out what that meant.
Wikipedia it is!
Yeah. Oh, Faraday? Yeah, bring him in.
So that's what I wanted to talk about. I think because there was that sort of political thread in the politics of James Mill and then his son, John Stuart Mill, and in Jeremy Bentham, that might lead into what you want to talk about, Paco, which is
if only there had been a lost character named Machiavelli, it'd be like smooth transition into what I was going to talk about. So one of the things that, we came across in reading about this topic obviously is famous Italian from the Renaissance period who's credited as being one of the fathers of modern political philosophy and, is credited with the notion of the ends justify the means, which is a paraphrase, I think, of what he wrote. It's one of those weird things like, Sherlock Holmes never said elementary, my dear Watson. But where that paraphrase comes from is this book that he wrote called The Prince, which was basically kind of like a rule book for politicians about how to acquire and maintain power. And it's, a really kind of cold-hearted, cold-blooded set of rules about, kind of do whatever you need to do to acquire and maintain power. And, I think he's an interesting person because like all men who lived in the Renaissance was kind of a quote-unquote Renaissance man and wasn't just this...
I never thought of that before. Everyone was a Renaissance man.
All you had to do is be alive.
I mean,
it's like 1650 and you would have been a Renaissance
seemingly
man.
Kind of, because he wasn't just a politician or, somebody who hung around in the back rooms of, the castles and gave advice to whoever was in power. He's also a military tactician, which is obviously heavily related, but also obviously a writer, but not just a writer of, political materials, but also wrote plays and wrote
But didn't he
songs
also,
and wrote
isn't
poetry.
part of this that like he thought that he accumulated his power because he ultimately believed that it was the responsibility of the state to provide for the well-being of its citizens, and that you could only do that if you had consolidated power. I mean, I think the reason he comes up in this conversation, and the reason that I think he's related to James Mill in some ways is because he was essentially saying, like, do whatever you need to do to hold on to your power, because that is what will allow you to create a good society that is fair and just. The other option is like basically anarchy.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's why he comes up in this conversation. For me, the most interesting thing about it, which I was about to get to, is there's a lot of contemporary analysis of his writing and his work that concludes that it was not a rule, that the Prince wasn't a rule book for monarchs and royal families about how to gain and maintain power. It was satire, and it wasn't written for those people because those people already knew the rules. It was written for the masses to basically say, this is how the political system works, and it sucks, and it's evil, and if you want to fight against it, these are the rules that these guys are playing by. Because he
was like a double agent.
Yeah, basically because, and who knows? I think like at some point in his life, that may have been the way that he was operating, and if he had written The Prince earlier on in his life, that may have been what his motives were. But he basically saw, he worked for the Borgias, he worked for the Medici, and he saw the Medici go out of power and come back into power. And when they did, they arrested him and tortured him for 3 weeks, hung him by, I can't remember what it's called, but they basically like tie your hands behind your back and then hang you by your hands so that it dislocates both your shoulders. Like, they tortured the fuck out of that dude for 3 weeks. And then when he like got out of that, it was like, all right, I'm writing The Prince.
Right.
And
he wrote it in exile. Like, he was no longer on the ups.
So I just think it's interesting because, the thing that he's best known for, which is kind of that book, or the thinking from that book. I don't think that many people actually like read that book. It's just kind of the teachings or the rules that are in that book that he's known for. At one point, I think in his life, he may have believed in all of that and thought that this is how you acquire power so that you can rule over people and, Anakin Skywalker style, like make all the decisions for everybody and like rule an empire. God, fuck, those movies were bad.
They're so terrible.
But in the end, when he actually put pen to paper and wrote that stuff down, he was potentially doing it from the opposite perspective, kind of having learned why that is a bad way of operating from a political and governmental standpoint, and writing it as satire.
Yeah, we forget how the context of things change over time. Who was the Italian dictator during World War II? Mussolini. Like, the quote is, the dictator is running the country, but at least the trains run on time.
Right.
We think of that as the minor benefits of a structured, very dictatorial organization. But the joke was at the time, the trains never ran on time. He was bad at that too. Like, we don't get that joke because we weren't aware of that particular contextual piece of history.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. So my piece, when I wanted to look at the idea of utilitarianism in terms of the ends justify the means, to follow the Machiavelli apocryphal quotation, was looking at the state of modern Scrabble, of all things.
I almost brought this topic too.
A consequentialist Scrabble?
No.
Like, Scrabble was a very educated game about word
literacy
on the board.
basically.
Literacy, like Queen Victoria played it. It was a huge viral trend. And even now, competitive Scrabble playing in the UK is not about defeating the other opponent, but it's about what is the maximum high score you can achieve together as two players that you can kind of build on each other. But what's happening is that some of the biggest and most successful competitive Scrabble players now don't even have English as their first language.
Right.
They just know the sequence of tiles of quote unquote game pieces that need to be arranged in a certain order to win, and they're disintermediated from the quote unquote moral objective of improving your literacy or enjoying the linguistic value of being able to stem these words into other variations. And
I've played Scrabble with some assholes like that. Because there's a lot of defensive playing too, right?
Yeah.
Of like, I know that if I play this word here, then you will never be able to play any
Quijibo.
interesting word.
From the utilitarian point, that is a successful strategy because you can win. You can achieve more points.
Yep. And that's really interesting because, I mean, if you look at a Scrabble dictionary now, it's like full of insane, like 2, 3, and 19-letter words or whatever that are just like not words that anyone knows unless they're Scrabble players.
And any averagely good Scrabble player.
Averagely good.
Averagely good, not a beginner, but not a professional. All of them memorize all of the 2-letter words. There's only like 30 of them, and you just have to memorize them as if they're just, like how does a pawn move? Like this. Memorize the 2-letter words,
right?
And it changes the nature of what the game was intended and how people play it. Even to the point that there's a great. I don't believe it's a TED talk. I believe it's an Ignite talk. See show notes for details. Where an individual shows you how to win at Scrabble by basically hustling Scrabble in terms of forcing people to challenge you for words that you would like them to think aren't real words by your body language and your demeanor and your playing style and your frequency and your cadence and the time you take and the choices you make in order to gain the benefit of that misattributed challenge. So from a utilitarian point of view, Scrabble is a wholly different game.
Yeah, really nerdy and not very fun.
Yeah, I mean, are you describing it the way it was or the way it is now? Because I kind of feel like...
I highly recommend, to drop a name, Stefan Fatsis wrote the definitive book on modern Scrabble, Word Freak, that was actually turned into a documentary, which has a great take on the utilitarian aspect of gameplay.
Interesting.
Well, I'm going to go watch it right now.
That wraps it up for this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the show and give us a rating in iTunes. As always, you can find us online at you'vegotitallwrong.net, where you can find show notes for today's episode. You can also send us an email to feedback@you'vegotitallwrong.net with questions, comments, or recommendations for show topics. And you can also follow us on Twitter. I'm at Paco Allen.
I'm at Chad Allen.
And I'm at M. Sanders.